Good afternoon. I wanted to thank you for coming to this event. On behalf of 21st Century Scientists, we would like to welcome the Executive Director of Story Collider, I just said that, Liz Neeley. So give you a little bit of idea of what 21st Century Science is about. The mission of this organization is to promote diversity, inclusion, but also equity. And we strongly believe that science communication and reaching outside of the ivory tower is an excellent way to achieve that goal. To tell you a little bit about Liz Neeley herself, she is a marine biologist by training. And she's been active in science communication for about 12 years now. And a funny note is that Liz spent some time back at the University of Washington before going to Story Collider. And that's actually how I met her when I was a graduate student there, when I was actually doing media training with Liz. And so she's been at this a long time and really looking forward to hearing her perspective. Please welcome Liz Neeley.
All right, well, hello, everybody. Grace in action. I have made the cardinal mistake of wearing a dress with no pockets and no belt, so I'm tethered to the podium in a way that I typically would not be. But so, I recognize you, some of you, from the show last night, but in case you're not familiar with what Story Collider is, I thought I'd give you a quick introduction. So, we consider ourselves to be an arts nonprofit. We host live stage shows, much like the Moth. Our tagline is true personal stories about science. It's 10 minutes, personal stories, a person in front of a microphone, no slides, no talks. It's just everything from the hilarity to the heartbreak of what it's like to be a person in science. We do about 40 of these shows per year. So I'm based in Washington, D.C. We're regular there, as well as in New York, Atlanta, St. Louis, Boston, Los Angeles, and we travel all over the country, and as well as in the UK and Canada as well. We record all of those stories, and then send some of them to our weekly podcast. Every Friday, a new episode comes out with 2 stories. And this is what the opening of that sounds like.
A science story, huh?
Is that what scientists say? It was that golden moment.
Because science was on my side.
Now when you have headphones in, you can really hear that we played with the stereo on this, so it sounds like these voices are swirling around you. And in the radio and TV business, we would call this vox pop, vox populi. The voice of the people, many experiences and perspectives woven together into some greater whole. Now some skeptics, cynics, critics would say, who wants to hear stories about science? And my answer is, well, right now we're logging between 250 and 300,000 downloads per month. So there's an audience here for this. And my team is made up of people, many of them are veteran and professional performers. They were trained in sort of the comedy and improv scenes mostly in New York, but also all over. And yet when I look at pictures of us on stage, this is my artistic director, Erin Barker, she's the first woman who ever won the Moth Grand Slam Championship twice. I get this weird sort of out-of-body feeling experience because this is not me, right? This is not where I started. As you heard, I'm a marine biologist by training. And this picture is a bit dark and murky because sometimes so were my diving conditions. I was really interested in the evolution of color patterns and visual systems in tropical reef fish, in wrasses specifically. This is a terminal phase mammal, as they call them. And the kinds of questions I was after was not what do fish look like to humans, but rather, what do these fish look like to other fish? Which meant that I was necessarily undertaking more sort of like mathematical modeling and other kinds of approaches to allow me to engage in this world that I couldn't trust my own eyes to tell me about. I loved the lab work, I loved the field work, I loved the math and the data. I hated people. Like, I really did not want to talk to people in general about my work. And so when I was forced into communications exercises, when I had to do my elevator pitch, what I would say, and I'm ashamed to admit I actually inflicted this on the woman who cut my hair, is, what do? Oh, I study the synonymous, non-synonymous substitution ratios and transmembrane regions of rhodopsins and the retinas of grasses and parrotfish. Right? Like, so in my mind, I thought I was succeeding. In fact, that was precisely what I studied in a very narrow sense and made no sense to anyone else outside my field. And I was particularly failing to get at the questions that were driving me, which was, what is signal? What is noise? How do fish take in information about their environment and make decisions about it, turning information and turning this into value? And in fact, I faced similar problems later in my career. Signal, noise, overwhelming sensory environments. You know what it's like, right? You walk into a room, nobody knows, you're loud, you're having a hard time processing. And yet our brains do this incredible work of allowing you to focus on one person and all of that crowd noise. And so you can see this sometimes. Like, you hear me saying the cocktail party problem. This is a waveform of my voice saying that. And we can see the words, the decibels, right? But the truth is that against that noisy background, our brains are doing incredible processing to pull it out and allow you to hear me against everything that's going on. And so I think of this as a metaphor for the world we live in now about what do we do when it feels like we're overwhelmed by the news cycles or flooded in social media? How do we amplify the signal of our science and the experiences of people in science? There's one more fish picture I want to show you before we move into storytelling. And I have the clicker, so I get to do this. So these are both lemon damselfish species. If I asked you to make some assessment of how could you tell one species from the other, what kinds of things would you point out? Like, usually people are like, oh, there's kind of a dark dot on the pectoral fin of one of those. And yet we forget, again, our human eyes looking at these are missing all of the information that's held in UV spectrums, right? And so this idea that there could be all sorts of information coded in ways that we completely miss is captured in this phrase, Umwelt. The idea that every species has a sort of like sensory way of processing the world. And again, that's a metaphor for all of us, the ways we've been socialized, the way we grow up, and the things that we expect to see, the things we are able to see. And so I know for me, growing up as a kid who always wanted to do science, from the time I was 5 years old, I wanted to study fish. No whales, no dolphins, you guys. I wanted to study fish, and I was a serious kid, and I wanted to be a serious scientist. So this idea of storytelling was almost anathema to me, because I thought of stories as like fairy tales, right? Something for small children, or worse, in a science sense, I was sort of conflating it with the idea of hand waving. That storytelling is what you do when maybe your data is not strong enough to hold up to rigorous analysis and you want to just ease people into agreeing with your interpretation. But the truth is, not all stories begin with once upon a time. One of my favorite quotes that I've read recently is from the author of The Three-Body Problem. It's a fictional work, Liu Xixin, who says, "The stories of science are far more magnificent and strange than any we find in literature. Only these wonderful stories are locked in cold equations that most of us do not know how to read." If any of you in the audience recognize this one, this is the Rescorla-Wagner equation. This equation holds the beautiful story of that moment when your expectation of the world finds a mismatch with reality and aha, learning has happened. This is the basis of conditioned learning. And what I came to understand as I dug my way into science communication and the storytelling world is that humans are storytelling machines. And this is an adaptation of us as a species. So not only do we need to worry about predation by things like wolves and lions and cave bears, right? But one of the big threats to us are other people. So we need to be able to divine the motivations, the behavioral states, the intentions of other human beings. And so you see our brains at work trying to make sense of information around us, looking for patterns and attempting to understand motivations. And some of my favorite work comes from going way back to the 1940s. Neurotypical adults and children, if you show them just simple shapes, but especially once you start to animate them, will almost impossibly always come up with stories about that poor little blue dot being menaced by these threatening red triangles, right? We are engaged in a nearly incessant stream of narrative and storytelling. And like I said before, I used to resist this and think this is what makes us weak and our science makes us strong because then we can be objective. But then I really thought about what this meant to the evolution of humans. And I realized stories are profound because they are a mechanism by which we package information about who we are, what we care about, and how we survive. And we spread that information through space and time. The beautiful thing about stories is not only do we find them pleasurable to listen to, but we also like to recreate them and share them with other people. And if this sort of touchy-feely, feel-good, stories have a resonance and a stickiness that no data set ever will. You don't trust that? Well, trust the National Academies. Trust the researchers who study the science of science communication. Trust the entire body of professionals who are currently working on reconceptualizing what we call science literacy, away from the memorization of an arbitrary body of factual knowledge to a more inclusive definition that really thinks about science as a process, science as a culture, science as a human undertaking, no less. One of my pet peeves as an executive director of the Story Collide of an organization that does storytelling is that the phrase itself has become a buzzword, right? Put a Google alert on that and your inbox will be flooded with how storytelling can improve everything from your marketing to your leadership to making your hair grow in thicker. It's really obnoxious, and I pushed back against it initially because of that. So I thought it might be helpful for me to talk about what we mean at Story Collider when we talk about stories about science. So stories have two critical elements when we really boil it down: characters and causality. So characters, people, and then things happening to them, them making decisions that lead to further things happening and things happening to them. This is a place where I often find scientists a little bit hesitant, and for good reason, right? We all care about establishing causality and not presuming it. But if your instinct is no, we just are going to give a rigid chronology, the truth is we know what that looks like. When you attempt to tell history as a chronology, you get something like the Annals of St. Gall. These crack me up. Flood everywhere, great crops. The presbyter died, also fighting on a Saturday. I mean, you get this sense of a community, of a society on the verge of collapse. There's all sorts of death and devastation, but the natural and social disasters happen sort of what seeming random with no connection, and we don't know if these things are good or bad. Was Pippin a hero or a villain? We have no idea. And so what we're actually looking for are these causal linkages. And we can go back to our fairy tale structures to give us a good sense of what this feels like. So in a fairy tale sense, right, what do we have? We have once upon a time the world was this way. And every day the world was the same until one day something kicks off the action, right? Then because of that, until finally, by dramatic confrontation, and then ever since then, the world has been different. This is the story spine for maybe a fairy tale. But every kind of professional performance or art that engages in storytelling has its own sort of formats and expectations. And I think it's useful to look at some of these that structure our expectations of the world around us. All of us have seen Hollywood blockbuster movies. We all know that they're kind of formulaic in some ways. It shocked me the first time I read this book. It's a classic, Save the Cat, How to Be a Screenwriter. And it has what's called a beat sheet of what has to happen in your film script to make the executives happy. And those numbers in parentheses, those are the page numbers of the script on which that stuff is supposed to happen. And if you don't have one of those components, you don't have a sellable script. You don't have a big budget blockbuster movie. And once you start to understand this framework and look for it, you see it everywhere. So let's imagine this in a visual sense, right? So there's sort of this classic idea of a 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. In the beginning, that's the way, the once upon a time in the world, the way it was. And then you've got that inciting incident, kicks things off. And at some point, our hero is launched onto their journey, and you have this sense that the world is never going to be the same. Their life is going to be changed because of this adventure they're setting off on. This is the hero with 1,000 faces stuff, right? In Act 2, that's the confrontation. There's usually rising actions. Things often get worse because usually our hero doesn't have either like the life skills or the team that they need to successfully fight the bad guys. So they're learning along the way. And then in the end, you've got this dramatic conclusion, the climax. We can take these colored blocks, go back to that beat sheet, color code it so that it matches, and then overlay sort of the inciting incident, the break into scene 2, and etc. The reason I do this is because it helps me maintain a grasp on the audience expectations in terms of timing of when this stuff needs to happen. I desperately wish I knew this before I told my first Story Collider story, which basically amounted to 7 minutes of me rhapsodizing about oysters, because guys, I love oysters, before I finally got anything happening in my story. You can be the most gifted rhetorician in the entire world, and after a while, people are going to be like, and something's got to happen, come on. So we can leave Hollywood and go to another sort of artistic lens on this stuff, and I'm going to steal an idea from Kurt Vonnegut. So in the 1950s, he submitted a master's thesis, an idea that was rejected, but turns out to hold up. So if you imagine space, up at the top we've got great good fortune, health, wealth, well-being. Down at the bottom, the inverse of that, sorrow, sickness, death. As your story moves through time, it needs to have ups and downs to it. Because if your story is, I'm awesome, I've always been awesome, this thing happened, and I was awesome, and everything's awesome, it's the most boring thing, you guys. So we need to have these changes, these shifts. And in fact, it turns out, again, it's a reasonable thing to think that there is a template that we crave, that we look for, that we recognize. When you take 40,000 works of fiction in the English language, and you chunk it through sort of semantic analysis using big computer programs. This is work out of the University of Vermont and University of Adelaide, and what we find is that 6 major story shapes fall out. And these are familiar to us, right? So in the first place, we have rags to riches, starts low, ends high, yay! The inverse of that would be a tragedy. Now we can start adding inflection points into it, and they become more compelling. So we've got woman in a hole. I'm walking along doing everything, something happens that's bad, and then because of, I don't know, my gumption and teamwork, I work my way out of it. The inverse of this would be a story of like greed or a lack of humility, of flying too close to the sun, and guys, you know poetic justice feels good, right? So keep going with this, add another curve to that. We've got the Cinderella story, and you can find Vonnegut telling the story during a chalkboard talk. It starts bad. Her parents are dead, she's working endlessly in ashes with an evil stepmother, right? But then she gets a fairy godmother, she gets a coach, she gets a gown, she goes to the ball, she meets the prince, and then there's the precipitous drop when the clock strikes 12. At this point, things are worse than they started because she had a taste of what happiness could be. And then it all ends happily ever after. Our final shape always makes me laugh. It's called Oedipus, and we just kind of avoid that in our science communication. I'm joking. But like, When I first was learning about these shapes, when I heard people talking about story shapes when I was still in science, I actually felt resentful because I couldn't figure out how my oyster science, how my fish research could get shoehorned into something like this. It felt really artificial. And so I would love to geek out about structure with you later if that's your thing, but if this is not your thing, that's okay. Roughly 80% of what you need to know to improve your own science communication using narrative techniques is dead simple. Have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and in the middle, things have to change. And so when we think about these tools, storytelling, why would I want you to add it to your toolkit? I used to fall into the same mistakes that some of my colleagues make of thinking, well, they're really engaging and they're really entertaining, so we'll use it as a way to like draw people in and then hit them with the science, right? And I think this is at the root of some really bad advice I sometimes see, where people are like, sex up your science, make it cool and interesting to people, put out like dinosaurs and chocolate and sex. If you don't study dinosaurs, chocolate, or sex, don't do that, right? So our science is not broccoli. It's endlessly fascinating. You and your magnificent obsession, the thing that you are devoting your life to, that merits attention, and you don't have to trick people into it. So my answer to this question of why tell stories is a little different, and you're not going to see education in this list. I think we tell stories for a number of reasons. One is to give voice to experience, because it is both important and powerful, and sometimes cathartic for us to share what we know, what we've seen, what we've lived. And stories are not only something that we tell. This is not a broadcast performance. To really appreciate it, you find yourself listening hard to stories and prioritizing them in a new way. And when you do that, you realize that why stories? Because they allow us to bear witness to suffering. Because there are problems in this world that our science cannot touch, that all of our best research cannot solve and doesn't even go into the beginning of solving. But what we know is that when people feel heard, that plays into issues around procedural fairness. We live in a democracy. Sometimes policy outcomes are not in line with what you want. But if you feel like you have been taken into account, you are more likely to be satisfied with that result. I think these two things together go towards the social legitimacy of science. I also think on a very personal level, we know, for example, from the narrative medicine programs at Columbia University, that for patients who suffer intractable, chronic, untouchable pain, something that no drug can help, on the days that they are going to session, on the days that they are telling their story and feeling heard, they report less pain. I think this matters. I think we also tell stories to construct identity, to tell who gets to be a scientist, who succeeds, how many hours is it reasonable to have to work per week to prove that you are serious in this world. We police our professional boundaries by the kinds of stories we tell about good and bad members of our professions. And finally, we tell stories to connect knowledge to action. Because sometimes it's not that we don't need the data, we desperately, urgently need the data. That's why, for me, it's a pleasure to be in a room with Dr. Kate Clancy, who does work on sexual assault and harassment in some of the field sciences. It's also why we need campaigns like this one. Me too. I've told my story. I also know what it feels like to see that just pouring out over social media and the impact that has had on people who thought they had a handle on this problem. Now, I am touching on heavy and dark topics, and you can hear from my language that I don't shy away from emotion. But I'm a scientist at heart, and to be convinced of all this stuff, I needed more than emotion. And so I started making my peace with my career shifting into science communication, and particularly moving into the storytelling realm, by reading the technical literature. So here's a quick and sort of broad brushstrokes overview of what we know from psychology, cognitive neuroscience, the social sciences, and so forth. Compared to argumentative or evidence-based communications like exposition and all the rest of that, stories are privileged. They seem to have a different sort of cognitive priority in our very human brains. And as a consequence of this, what we see is that stories are more compelling. So people want to listen to them in the first place, and they want to keep listening to them. They're also easier to understand. Information packaged this way, rather than sort of an argument or statistics-based format, is easier for people to understand and then also to access again, to remember in the future. We also know that even when they are explicitly labeled as fictional, stories, this narrative format, are more believable. And perhaps most important of all to those of us who worry about ideologically driven debates where science is being unfairly maligned, we know that personal stories are more persuasive than throwing any amount of data at an audience. If you are used to coming to science communication talks, if you've been paying attention to this for a while, you're probably familiar with this idea, you might not know the term for it, called the science deficit model. This old, outdated concept that people don't care about science or they resist it because they just don't know enough. And if only they knew what we know, we would all like hold hands and skip happily down the path of life together. We know this isn't true. And in fact, worse, we know that continuing to meet people with more and more and more data not only can entrench them in a previous existing position, you can also get boomerang effects where someone who was never worried about a thing before all of a sudden is like, wait, they're saying that vaccines are safe, and I don't really trust them. Why are they saying this? And then they become concerned. When I think about the evidence base for this, it really makes me, this is a central point of my entire talk and my entire career, which is we are outgunned, outfunded, we might be facing spokespeople of our opponents who are perhaps more charismatic, certainly in many instances less bound to the standards of truth that we as scientists embrace. And in that case, what do? I think we turn to the best available science to help us. And that science tells us stories are powerful tools. So I sincerely hope that as a community of people who care about science communication, we can begin to become as critical, as rigorous, as experimental, as creative in our science communication as we are in the science that we hope to communicate in the first place. And so what I'm hoping to avoid in the future are more conversations like the ones I get into on Twitter all the time, and after talks like these all the time, where someone inevitably wants to say, oh yes, but the plural of anecdote is not data, as if I haven't heard that and said that myself countless times, right? You're right, stories are not the same as data. In fact, it's a really different thing. One of the phrases I've heard that I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but I like the way it sounds, is that science communication is about conveying facts. Science storytelling is about digging for deeper truths. And so the standards by which we hold these two things are different, right? So there seem to be sort of three broad categories of differences between science communication versus the storytelling. One is about generalizability, the direction of generalizing from a very specific personal thing to a broad truth, versus looking at all of our statistics to make predictions about specific behaviors. The next is about how much context is included in matters and is also made explicit. And then finally, it's about the legitimacy and how we judge whether these things are true and correct. Science gives us a way to make predictions about the world, and we judge it accordingly, depending on whether its predictions are held up. Stories are judged by what we call verisimilitude. Do they feel like something plausible and correct and truthful? Do they feel like they hold information that can be useful to us? And this idea of feelings being an important criteria for something took me a very long time to get used to. And to be truthful, I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it. So when I began, I started looking for how do we get at emotions, and I thought, oh, well, neuroscience, like brain imaging stuff, this is really good, right? Like I'll look into this idea of speaker-listener neural coupling, where if I'm using really vivid sensory language to talk about like the delicious, chilled, cold, salty noodles I had at lunch, like your brains will be lighting up in sort of similar ways. And then I realized that I was engaging in a little bit of sleight of hand myself. That kind of stuff, like I know enough about this science to know I'm not entirely sure how good the replication is. I also know that I was using it in a way that was a little bit of like, you guys are scientists, here's some science, tell stories. And this gets us into trouble. And it gets us into trouble in interesting ways. So I don't know how many of you saw the New York Times Magazine article that's just very recently come out about Dr. Amy Cuddy's work. You might know her name from the Power Poses. She gave one of the second most viewed ever TED Talk. She has been vilified by her colleagues in the press. She's had co-authors go on record saying they do not believe any of the results that they published together. At this point in my talk, I'm not defending her or going to talk about the specifics of this, but she told a story for Story Collider in 2014. And I want you to hear a clip that I've pulled from it, her reflecting on her research career.
The craziness of head injury, part of it is that I don't know, because I can't remember. I just don't know what I was like before. I only know what I am like now. I don't know how I ended up at Harvard. It was never on the radar for me, ever. And I ended up at Harvard studying how people can become their aspirational selves. Like, how can you become a self that you're not now? And I realized that, and it's funny because part of it is just giving these talks, and this was really hard, thinking about this and having to process this and go over this, and even just talking to my dad about it, and that the hardest breakup wasn't with my best friends. What happened was that I realized at a moment where I realized that I had to break up with my past self.
So what you hear her talking about here is she suffered a traumatic brain injury. She was in coma for 7 months when she was an undergraduate. And then she's really struggled with this idea. I love that line about how do we come to terms when we are not our aspirational selves. And what I think this is tying into for me is some of the research I've read about in which not only are we using stories and narratives as a way to structure information and make sense of the world, but also make sense of ourselves, to unite our pasts, the things we've done, who we've been, with our projections of who we will be and what we will do in the future. If you want to dig deeper into this, all of the conversation around this piece, listen to the Story Collider story, read this New York Times Magazine article, read the blogs of the statisticians and those involved in open science and replication movements to understand how complicated this is. Think about what it means that a prominent female scientist is the one who is becoming the poster child of p-hacking, which a lot of people, for a long time, engaged in. And I think this is where we start to realize how difficult it is to disentangle right and wrong. Who's correct? What does the data actually say? And this is why stories are powerful. This is why you hear political campaigns talking about owning the story, dominating the narrative. Because stories are how human beings collectively make sense of ambiguity, attribute causation, figure out who the villains and the heroes are. And it's not just something that's happening in our heads. I think storytelling is really intriguing for me as someone who performs it from the stage and teaches it, because it's somehow embodied. Like, you know what it's like when your audience is bored, when Felipe is on his cell phone, when people are yawning or fidgeting, or their eyes are drifting off into the distance. And you also know what it looks like when somebody has rapt attention, right? There's cool work on this. So humans, as a species, evolved as visual creatures. And so we tend to keep our eyes wide open in moments of uncertainty. And then when that tension is released, we blink. Masterful storytellers and movies that have their audience enraptured actually induce statistically significant synchronized eye blinking rates among audiences, which blows my mind. Now, this is not something you can see, so don't waste your time on stage trying to look at your audience and see if they're doing it. But the cool thing about this work is that it also ties into that feeling of being sucked into a story world. That feeling really matters for some of the outcomes you care about for your science communication, particularly persuasive outcomes. The jargon for this is called transportation. You know what it feels like when you're reading a book and you can't hear people calling your name, or you've been in a movie theater for 3 hours and you can't believe that time has passed. You're in a transported state. What we know is going on for people who are highly transported is a couple of things. One is intensive processing, and the other is uncritical processing. Intensive processing is just the magnitude of your emotional response, independent of whether it's like happy or sad. So it's the difference between listening to a story and being like, oh yeah, that was a sad story, versus ugly weeping, right? And then uncritical processing, this is not about shutting people's brains down. It is not about fighting logic or losing hold of logic. Rather, it is a reduction in the tendency to counter-argue in the middle of a narrative. And so this has to do with the coherence, the internal coherence of the story world. So for example, if someone's telling this story and you're totally buying it, and then they're like, and then my 4-year-old said, and then they start saying something that's ridiculous that a 4-year-old would never actually say, particularly in language that a 4-year-old would not use, that breaks the spell, right? So then you've got counter-argument going on. So if you're interested in persuading your audience, you know you want them transported. And so the question for those of us who are scientists and who like to analyze these things is, how do we increase intensive and uncritical processing through a story? And the answer is we can look into what are called narrativity factors. You get charts that look like this. My artistic director hates the fact I even show this slide. It's important for me to be able to intellectually understand the qualities of a story so that the advice I'm giving to my storytellers are based in something empirical or at least theoretical. So this has to do with the narrative schemata, the way that your story shapes, match our expectations. I showed you some of that stuff. About transitivity and transactiveness, which is the relationship between characters and how they're interacting. But the thing is, we know that transportation varies from person to person and also like over the course of your day and your life. We know it depends on things like prior knowledge, reading strategies, personality, gender comes into it sometimes, but we know that we can improve it. I think the problem with this very intellectual approach to storytelling, and the reason that Story Collider succeeds is because we understand it has to be an equal partnership of the science and the art of storytelling. And you can feel the difference because this chart talks about affect. Affect, we're talking about feelings and emotions, right? We actually use Pixar's Inside Out as a starting place in the workshops that we do because these characters are based on pretty reasonably good neuroscience and descriptions of human emotions, basic human emotions. But when people push and say, why do I have to talk about emotions? I think they're bad. I think it distracts people from logic and the critical thinking we want them to do. I think there's a couple different kinds of arguments. One of them is pragmatic. So if you want your material to go viral, when we look at actually what does go viral, we know that feelings, joy, awe, all the rest of it come into play. We also understand that emotional flow, those ups and downs in the story world, seem to be intimately connected to many of the qualities that you're looking for. So even if they don't persuade people on their own, they might induce them to re-engage with a piece of work, listen to it again, or talk to their friends and family. So when you really start thinking about models of agenda setting and behaviors in which people actually are persuaded, we know feelings play a crucial part. And I think this is where it gets tricky, right? Because we talk about, well, like one man's trash is another man's treasure. How do we make sure that people recognize the thing that we think is good is actually good and they don't feel resistant? And this is where we can start talking about how emotions reflect value structures. This is a smallest space analysis based on 68 countries and nearly 65,000 peoples, showing that values seem to universally clump together. So, for example, if you're someone who really values power, so reputation, preserving your image, authority, wealth, because that's a manifestation of it. Something that happens that's good for you, that you feel quite proud of, might trigger people in a different part of the spectrum who really value benevolence or like community feeling or humility. It might seem self-aggrandizing or rude. And this is where that transportation state comes in and is helpful, because when you tell a story about yourself and you tell it in a skilled way, your audience engages in what's called perspective taking. That even if they disagree with you about what the topic is, they start to imagine your motivations. They can't help but imagine what you would be doing and how you would feel in those situations. And they bring those feelings back into their reality. This matters because it's not just the topics that are, the hot topics, science communication things of the day that matter. Story Collider stories touch on everything from climate change to animal research to sex ed and abortion. And yet we don't see the trolls coming after us. And I think it's because the difference of, this happened to me, I experienced this, I felt this, it changed me this way. People are willing to listen to that. And even if they don't think they agree with you, sometimes their attitudes shift. But the minute you go into that lecturing mode of, and therefore you should do this, people shut down. And it's important not just for conveying information, talking about data, right? Because humans have strong social norms. So the stories we tell really get at questions like, what is normal? What's okay? I was reminded of this, I was having dinner with Dr. Jo Handelsman last week. Listening to her story of working in the Office of Science and Technology Policy under President Barack Obama was incredible. Within the first 45 minutes after she had taken her oath, she suddenly was introduced to what would become the Ebola outbreak. This was before anyone knew. And I know that she has all sorts of stories she can't tell from that time. But some of Jo's work is also around inclusion and representation in STEM science disciplines. She publishes all these papers. Many other people who I don't have time to name here too are building sort of the rigorous methodological case that we have a problem. We know that even our technical minds, even our peers, are not only convinced by data. This also goes back to that idea of the science deficit model. We think, oh, people don't believe us because they don't know the facts underneath. The truth is, across many dimensions and for all kinds of people, we know the facts just fine. Sometimes we assault them, but you can recall it back to mind. But what we believe about the world are the inferences that we make on how things really work. So for me, I think about, there's a whole literature about medical education. It's called the hidden agenda. And on one hand, medical students are put through all sorts of ethics training. They're told constantly about patient-centered care and having these diverse teams of people from many disciplines working together. And by the end of the third year of their medical school, their ethical behaviors and standards actually drop. What we know is that you can give all the lip service in the world you want, put people through all the courses you want, but when they're in the hallways, when they're on grand rounds, when they go to conferences and see how people who are successful in the field actually behave, we know what is more powerful. And so in science communication, this goes towards things like little kids having assumptions about the world and what scientists look like. You've probably heard of these experiments, they're classic at this point. In 2000, 7th graders, so 11, 12-year-olds, were asked to do an exercise where they were drawing a scientist. And almost without fail, and with all due apologies, they drew old white men who were balding with glasses in lab coats, doing dangerous things. They were wild and unpredictable, interesting but scary. And yet, when you took these same kids to Fermilab, where they met the nuclear engineers and the physicists, without any kind of prompting, without actually talking about diversity issues, the pictures they draw start to change. They draw people of color. You start to see both men and women being represented. And the paragraphs they write are adorable because they say things like, I didn't know you could be a scientist in ping pong. Like I do. And it's not just kids. It's not. One of my proudest moments for Story Collider, I've been an executive director for 2 years now, is that we're beginning to see the evidence of what it means for students, these are undergraduates, to listen to Story Collider episodes. This is work by Josh Shinsky et al. He teaches at a community college. Most of his students are non-science majors, first generation in higher education, many of them from underrepresented groups. And what they found in a reasonably well-controlled way is that the students who are listening to Story Collider episodes, you see a shift in their stereotypes about science, in the words they use to describe scientists, in their self-professed interest in these topics, and also the potential for them to go into it as a field themselves. Listening to these stories from many people talking about all the joys and failures and the reality of science reduces stereotype threats for these students, and those effects are stable over 6 months. Another line of inquiry that I find very intriguing is that even when you control for as much as you possibly can, looking at the technical literature in the climate change field, what we find is that papers whose abstracts are written with higher narrative qualities. Not in all ways, I'm not talking about strong feelings in these, but more like flow and connectivity, connection, that causal component. Those papers are more highly cited. And yes, it correlates with the kinds of journals that we publish in the typical format for those abstracts, but it also stands alone. So whether we're talking about the general public or our peers in our field, we know stories are powerful. And I think it's a good place to pause and talk about the difference between manipulation and persuasion. Because when you've got a big shiny tool, everything starts to look like a nail, right? And the truth is, we can use hammers to build houses or to kneecap people. It's not the tool itself that's a problem, not stories, not social media, none of it. It's the unthinking use of these tools. And so this really brings us into an area that's, we don't talk about all that much often in science communication, or philosophy and ethics. I was totally absorbed by this idea of, in the 5th century BC, there was a class of Greek, elite people, men, all of them, who were traveling the country, teaching young men excellence. They were getting paid to bring an elite class of young men up in the world. And at first it was things like combat and physical strength. And over time it started shifting, and the rhetorical arts were folded into that. So this idea that it's a source of power to wield your words in a way that will seduce, delight, and convince your audiences, right? Rhetoric. And yet, when you don't ask, why are you doing this? And are you doing it for good, sound, ethical reasons? Well, you might cross some people you don't want to cross, like Aristotle and Plato. And so this class, the people who were thinking about the power and beauty of language, the root word, Sophie, is wisdom. These were the sophists. Their name has become tied up in an insult, sophistry, right? Just the empty blather that's delightful and pretty on the outside, but groundless. So I think we really do need to ask ourselves about our motivations in science communication, and also how do we respect the agencies of our audiences? I have sat in rooms where I've heard people say things like, I don't care why people care about space, I'll lie to them, I just want to make them care about my space thing. And it makes my blood run cold to hear that. Now, when we think about storytelling, all of this aside, assume your intentions are really good and you are very rigorous in looking back, verifying the stories that you're telling and telling them to the best of your ability. You still may face criticism from your peers. You still may face this fear that you're undermining your credibility. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out here. One is, when you make a claim like, oh, scientists who tell stories become less credible in the eyes of the public, or they're skewing public debates, that's an empirical claim, we can test it. It's early days in some of this stuff, but we know that advocacy does not have the negative consequences that we think it does in the ways that we're looking at this. I also want to underscore that credibility is not something you build yourself. It's not your pedigree of where you went to school, where you publish, who do you work with. Of course, it's some of that. But it's also bestowed upon you by your audience, their assumption and their assessment of not only your competence, but also your goodwill and your trustworthiness. Particularly in high-stakes situations where there's life and death on the line. They're looking at you as a spokesperson for science and not only saying, do they know what they're talking about? But they want to know, do you know what I'm talking about? Do you understand me and my family? Do you care about us at all? And it feels like we live in times where there's all sorts of disasters right around every corner. My partner is a science journalist, and one of the things he's working on at the moment is pandemic preparedness. What the world looks like now and in the near future as new diseases emerge and spread. And in this piece, in The Atlantic, Ed had a poll quote that really kind of stopped me in the tracks because it captures all the fear that we have around science communication and storytelling and emotions. It's this, right? Ad-libbing, being emotional. It can be very dangerous in an epidemic. And that's true, our instinct is to be quiet, be careful, wait until we have consensus messaging. And we forget that silence has its own risks, that saying nothing is a choice, with real-world consequences as well. So when we think about stories, they are not merely broadcast tools that we use to persuade or perhaps manipulate, hope you don't. But the power of them is both that they are products and processes. That as you go through the work, and I think our storytellers can verify this, of crafting something that you might perform on stage about how science has shaped your life or your experience in it, that you're making sense of your own history, your own experience in the world in a slightly new way. Sometimes it's profound. And it is a risk. It does take courage to stand on a Story Collider stage, to bear some part of your soul, to talk about the insults and the assaults, the humor and the hilarity and the heartbreak that happen in science. And I'm proud of them. And these people shape my world. And I think they also shape the way that a lot of audiences who don't otherwise care about science come to understand the people who do it. So I want to bring this all to a close with a metaphor that might seem like a bit of a tangent in an unexpected direction. And that's with hummingbirds. So if you can, without punching your neighbors, stick your arms out. Show me how do birds fly? Like all of you with so there's some very artistic, brain wrist motion going on. But most of us, because we are human bodies with human arms, we flap. If you were a hummingbird, the way you would fly is imagine stitching your elbows to your ribcage and now flail your fingertips back and forth in a figure 8. This is how hummingbirds fly. It feels ridiculous and counterintuitive to us, right? And this is where the metaphor comes into play. Maybe you're not a hummingbird. Maybe you're a goose or a moth. I don't know. Maybe you have different kinds of stories to tell. But the thing is, your intuition is not necessarily the best guide of how to influence people, how to shape their world, how to make them remember you and your science. There are infinite ways that we can give our ideas loft and to get them to take flight. But we have to pay attention to both the empirical data around science communication as well as the hard-earned, hard-won craft of the artists and comics and performers and actors who've been doing this for hundreds of years. And just to think about what this means exactly right now in this moment in time. I understand what it feels like to be overwhelmed by the tyranny of the like, to be putting your heart out there into the world. My personal story was on the Story Collider podcast last week. I can't help but look at the numbers and think, that's not enough. I want more people to hear it. Have I wasted my time because it didn't go viral? And you start to see people complain, right? Because we know that it's not just what people actually like, but first mover effects and snowballs and the way that we act as herds or mobs. And sometimes you're a person who likes something, and sometimes you're a person who likes it because somebody you want to be close to likes it. And this leads to a lot of hand-wringing, right? Like, is the internet making us stupid? Is democracy going to fall because we're all just thoughtless sheep because we act as a mob? And I think I go back to my roots. I look at this and I think this looks almost like a school of fish or a flock of birds. And nobody ever asks whether birds are good or bad because they fly in flocks. If we're so inclined, we can marvel at the beauty of these murmurations moving across the evening sky. And we can also apply the full force of our intellect and ask all sorts of interesting questions of, how does this behavior happen? How do individuals maintain their place in the flock? How does a movement, sweep across? We can model this. And we know there are actually quite simple, small rules about maintaining your distance from your nearest neighbors, moving in the same direction. I think stories are one of the ways in which people fly in flocks. And so I think, if nothing else, after listening to me talk at you for almost an hour, I hope you'll leave here inspired, not by me, but by what you might do with some of this information. I look out into this room and I think you all are full of incredible stories. I hope you find the courage to tell them, and I hope you do the work to tell them well. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I know we're right at the hour, and I know that we have a reception afterward. Do you want me to take a couple questions? Yeah. So I'll take it. We'll run the mics.
So, Liz, I was Googling P-hack. But my question is, most of your message, if I understand this correctly, is towards the general public, like our friends who are not scientists, or our families who are not scientists, or like the people that we run into our lives.
Mm-hmm.
However, I completely agree with the message, but at least in my field, people don't want to know the personal. I agree that if you have a plugin, for instance, you have to give, then you want to tell a story, right?
So I disagree with you here. I think you're right. You never walk into any given situation and just start blasting out stories because we have expectations. The same way you wouldn't, like, if you were giving testimony in a criminal case and the judge says, like, was this person at this place at a certain time, you wouldn't be like, well, let me tell you a story. Or if you were giving testimony to Congress or something like that. But not all stories look like that. And I think we tell stories all the time in science, except they maybe are not recognized as such. And so it's maybe not what you do on stage, though it could be. You can use these techniques to think about which sub-experiments do you include, which ones do you not talk about. How do you connect sort of that causal chain as you come towards your conclusions. There is an element of that there, but then also who we give the stage to and what they talk about, and the whisper networks that are happening in the corridors all the time. I think stories are a fundamental human property, just not in this large sort of performative way. And so I think listening to them and telling them, maybe it plays for you, it comes more into the way you teach your courses. Maybe it's more about how you mentor your students and listen to the concerns of graduate students or postdocs who are struggling to make a union or to deal with mental health issues. But I fundamentally push back against this idea that stories are only good for the general public and scientists don't do them. We do. We're just trained to, we try not to, but we do anyway. And so in the science communication space, particularly when it comes to policy advocacy, we talk about how you can be an honest broker of this stuff, or all too often what happens is we become stealth advocates. We claim objectivity. We say that we're not telling stories, but we actually are. There's framing and there's values coming into play that we're not acknowledging and we're not critically examining. And so that's, I think, where I'm going more than anything else in this, is instead of saying, and I can't tell you how many scientists have said to me while they are literally shaking with rage, I don't have emotions about my work. Okay. And so I'm not saying everything should or even can be in this emotional space. But I do think, particularly when it comes to public engagement, that being fluent in some of these techniques and thinking about how we might put them to work for us can be an important advance.
Yes, too.
We'll take two.
I enjoyed your talk. But I was wondering if you could help us understand a little bit more by just giving us a sample of how you used storylines, acts, and story shapes in your talk today.
Yeah, so in the workshops that we teach, what we often find is that academics, faculty, no matter where they are in their career, will come to me and say, I love Story Collider, but I don't have any personal stories because I don't study cheetahs and I don't have a big exciting life. And so what we do first is we walk them through just coming up with a list of events in their life that they find themselves returning to and talking about, like what we're doing so far. And then choosing one of those and thinking about how do you tell the story of that. And it helps combat this urge where, like, if somebody wants to talk about, say, CRISPR or genetic technologies to an audience, they'd be like, well, I need to begin by explaining the structure of DNA to you, right? No, you don't. So when I think about acts, and I think about scenes, and I think about those shapes, I think really what it comes down to is when we tell the kinds of stories we tell on our stage, what we've asked is for our storytellers to think about how they personally changed over the course of events. And so you often see, it's like, so I've told stories, I even did it here in this talk. Early in my career, I didn't think any of this stuff matters, and I was really self-satisfied, and I sucked at communication. And then through that, I worked my way out through this kind of understanding. So it's not always explicit, and it's not always highly emotional, but so the Story Collider podcast, you can listen to just past stories that we've had. There's a recent one, for example, by a sociologist, Dr. Vaishon Ray at University of Maryland, talking about how one of his friends sent him the Facebook Live video of the murder of Philando Castile, and what that meant and what that did to him. And also how he thought about his own daughters, and they couldn't go out in the backyard and play with Nerf bags, and how he started to process it, and it ended up shifting his course of research. And now he does implicit bias trainings for police in Prince George's County and Maryland. But again, like sort of this emotional arc. It's what makes stories feel satisfying. So in a craft perspective, we often talk about the best stories are somehow both unexpected and entirely inevitable. And it's that feeling of triumphs and struggles. And when we talk about those feelings, what we're talking about is stakes. What are the consequences of things not going well? So just because I think I've rambled and not done a good example, I'll point you to one specific episode. Dr. Erin Jacob does tell a story about cheetah research. It's her first day in the field. She drives out, her Jeep gets stuck in a dry riverbed. Now you would think a story about being stuck for 12 hours might get boring, but what she does very artfully is first she talks about it's her first day in the field, she can't get stuck because that would be a reputational risk. Then she talks about she does not come from a family who gets stuck in mud. One time her mom was a game ranger, her engine died on her Jeep. She improvised with an antelope intestine and drove out. So now you see like the familial risk of being made fun of for getting stuck in the mud. It continues to get worse. She lies to her advisor and says things are fine when they're not. She comes to realize she is in a prohibited area of the Serengeti where the poachers are. So now she's not only put herself at risk, but the entire research project. They find out she's there. Finally, a hyena shows up. And so there's this big arc of the day getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and then her recovering from it. So this, I know is not a satisfying answer, but that's how I make sense of
it. Just out of curiosity, since you've probably listened to a fair number of these these talks, do you have a particular favorite for those of us that are immediately going to Google it after we get out of here?
A favorite of the Story Collider podcast? Ooh, yeah. No, but I can also point you to, we've written blog posts where our whole team has chosen their favorite episodes. I would say the cheetah episode that I just described is a good place to start. And also, I point that out because I would say maybe 2% of the scientists I've played this for have a negative reaction to it. Where they think, ooh, she lied to her advisor and she admitted that on a public stage. She is eroding the reputation of scientists everywhere. But it's a useful exercise. One of the hardest things I learned when I shifted out of science and into storytelling is that, again, that whole thing about like we're not emotional people is a lie. And scientists often have a very visceral, strong aesthetic reaction to a piece of work, and they label it bad. Instead of being able to critically examine what is the craft that goes into this, why does it work for the audience that it does work for, and coming to that realization that sometimes we are not good proxies for our audience, and so we need to bring in those outside perspectives and test whether it works or not. So listen to the cheetah story, and then I'll just rattle off a few others. Listen to the story of the neuroscientist whose dad had a stroke and it rearranged his homunculus, so he felt like his leg was coming out of his arm. And the scientist was thinking about, this is incredible, I can publish on this. Well, as a son, he wept. That's a good one. Listen to the woman who diagnosed her own brain tumor, or the fiddler who lost her hearing because of the chemotherapy treatments, but still plays. Listen to the neuroscientists talk about memory and family and history. Listen to some of my best friends talk about being chased across campus by a white professor screaming, "I'm not a racist." There's all sorts of ways in which these stories bear on who we are as scientists and how science touches our lives. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and I hope we can continue this conversation without any reception. So, thank you for joining.